group?
No, you don't.
Okay.
Okay, we are live whenever you're ready to begin.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We are in our second go around here for this performance funding work group. Just to remind everybody that's on here, those that may be listening also, that our main job here this time is to have a definition of underrepresented, to replace the underrepresented minority description that we've used in the past. The other is to decide what we will do with the 3% that we allocated this past year as a stopgap for underrepresented minority. As you remember, 1.5% went to first generation, 1.5% went to the already category of low income. So we have scenarios we've ran based on what you all have asked us to do. This will probably be the last time we have scenarios that we'll look at. That's why we asked you this previous time to give us all that you need so we can bring it back this time. We have basically 8 scenarios of definitions. If you categorize it in the weighted and unweighted category, ends up being 16. Our goal today is to not make a decision, but the next time we come back, we hope that will be the last time a decision will be made. So we're asking you to give serious consideration of the ones that you can can live with and ones you can't. So with that in mind, unless you have any particular questions for me, I won't take up our time by me talking, but have Bill jump directly into presenting these scenarios. Any questions, any thoughts, or anything you want to tell us about before we get started here? If not, Bill, I'm going to ask you to move through these, move through fairly fast if you could, so we can have some discussion. So let's not take all the time to go over every single detail of each of these unless the presidents and others that's on this work group have questions on.
Yes, sir, President Thompson. And just provide an overview of what we're going to cover today and what we're not going to cover today. You'll see the first item on our agenda are potential metrics, including low-income student, first-generation college student, underprepared student, high-need high school student, bachelor's degrees. We covered those at our first meeting of the work group, so we're not going to cover that same ground over again. I've included those same exact slides that we provided you last time so that they would be in this packet. What we are going to go over are 3 requested scenarios, and they were requested by Representative Tipton. He specifically asked for us to take those 4 metrics that you see listed under potential metrics and apply a 0.75% allocation to each of those 4 metrics and run that scenario, both weighted and unweighted, for sector cost and mission differences. He asked us to look at 3 metrics weighted at 1%, or allocated at 1% each, and that would be first generation, low income, and underprepared student bachelor's degrees. And then he asked for 3 additional metrics at a 1% allocation each, first generation bachelor's degrees, low income, and high need high school student bachelor's degrees. So we'll go over those 3 scenarios quickly. I mentioned at our last meeting that Morehead State University had proposed a metric, and we have sent out some scenarios to the group, 2 scenarios specifically, scenario 15 and 16. We'll go over those today, and then we'll circle back around and just remind everyone about the major decision points going forward. I will point out one thing. I've added some labels here. For example, this is the low-income student bachelor's degree metric. you'll see now that I've added the heading scenario 1 and 2. And then on the first generation student bachelor's degree metric, I've added scenario 3 and 4. So I've labeled all of these scenarios so that if a president or a member of the General Assembly or State Budget Director Hicks has a question about a specific scenario, you can refer to it by number. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and run through the 3 requested scenarios that Representative Tipton asked us to look at. And this is the first one. It's 4 bachelor's degree metrics. Again, first generation student, low income student, underprepared student, and high need high school student bachelor's degrees. And each one of those metrics has a 0.75 allocation in the model. And I'm going to try to, there we go, hide my screen here so I can actually see the slideshow. If you look at the table to the right, that first column of numbers is the 2024-2025 actual performance fund distribution. The 2 columns in the center of that table are scenario 9. That's the 4 bachelor's degree approach allocated at 0.75 each. Does not include a sector weighting. And then scenario 10, which are the 2 columns to the far right, it's the same 4 metrics, 0.75% allocation, but in this case, we include a sector weighting for each of those 4 metrics. As you can see by looking at that table, allocating that 3% that was formerly allocated to underrepresented minority bachelor's degrees, if we allocate that to those 4 bachelor's degree metrics at 0.75 each on an unweighted basis, it really does not shift very much funding around, with the exception of Western Kentucky University. They have an increase there of $506,000. So really not much difference between scenario 9 and the current year distribution. If we add in the sector weightings, you can see that 4 metric approach will shift $3.63 million from the comprehensive institutions to the research institutions. And by applying that weighting, it would restore about 91% of the $4 million that was given up by those research institutions in the current year, because weightings were not applied to that 1.5% for first generation bachelor's degrees and the 1.5% for low income bachelor's degrees. There was no sector weighting applied in the current year. And so that shifted $4 million in combined from UK and U of L to the comps. So if you restore that weighting, it would shift about $3.63 million back to the research sector. So that is that scenario. I'm going to move on to the next one, and we can take questions at the end of these 3 scenarios. The second set of scenarios that Representative Tipton asked us to run were 3 bachelor's degree metrics, specifically first generation bachelor's degrees, low income student bachelor's degrees, and underprepared student bachelor's degrees with a 1% allocation each. Again, looking at the table, first column of numbers is the actual distribution for 2024-25. Scenario 11 has no sector weighting, and scenario 12, those 2 columns show those 3 bachelor's degree metrics run through the model with a sector weighting applied. As you can see by looking at the table, by allocating that 3% to the unweighted first generation low income student and underprepared student bachelor's degrees, it does shift some funding from Eastern, UK, and Moorhead to Western, NKU, and U of L. And Eastern would shift the most dollars away from Eastern, and Western would be the biggest beneficiary of that shift in dollars. When the sector weights are applied as part of this 3 metric approach, it shifts $3.63 million from the comprehensive sector back to the research sector, and that would restore 91% of the funds that were given up by the research institutions in the current year. Lastly, Representative Tipton asked for 3 bachelor's degree metrics at 1% each. In this case, first generation student, low income student, and high need high school student bachelor's degrees. That's what this table is showing you in terms of scenarios 13 and 14. Again, the first column of numbers is the actual distribution for the current year. As you can see in scenario 13, allocating the 3% to unweighted first generation, low income and high need high school student bachelor's degrees does not shift very much money around between institutions compared to the current year distribution, current year actual distribution. When you reapply the sector weights, it would shift $3.68 million from the comps to the research institutions. And that weighting to account for cost and mission differences would restore 92% of the funds that were given up by the research institutions in 2020.
Bill, let me interrupt you for a second.
Yeah.
Folks that's on this panel, since y'all are you're a little on the screen, I can't see you well. If you wouldn't mind using the little hand gesture if you have questions, so then I can identify you and call on you. Until then, I probably won't be able to see you. Sorry, Bill.
So those are the three scenarios that Representative Tipton had requested, and we've done them both without the sector weighting and with the sector weighting. And you can see the budgetary impact, the hypothetical budgetary impact, and that's applied to the same data set that was used for the actual distribution in the current year, the same appropriation numbers, same mandated program numbers. So the only thing that has really changed is we've substituted out the 1.5% for first generation student bachelor's degrees that was unweighted, and the low income student bachelor's degrees that was unweighted. We swapped that out for the various scenarios that Representative Tipton requested. So does anyone have any questions at this point? Looks like Representative Tipton.
Representative Tipton, yes.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I requested these scenarios because I thought it was important for us to have more options to look at and consider, having no idea how the numbers would come out. Now, I know all of you presidents out there, and I know the first thing you're looking at in each scenario is how does that impact my institution? And I understand that. But I just thought it would be good to have some more options. And I think some of the things we need to consider, especially in these four considerations, is number one, how accurately and efficiently and effectively can they be identified to know for sure which students fall into those categories. And maybe CPE and some of the presidents maybe have some thoughts on that. And I'm just going to go ahead and get the elephant out in the room. I think the big decision point that's going to have to be made is weighting, whether we go with no sector weighting or with sector rating on these 3%. I have heard from all sides on this. I'm not here to pick sides, but I'm here to listen. And what can we do to what's going to be most effective and important for our students in Kentucky? So anyway, y'all seen the numbers. I'm anxious to kind of review the presentation from Dr. Morgan and Moorhead, and we'll see if we can come up with some good discussion today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Chair
President
Tipton.
McFadden, I see that your hand is up.
Thank you, Bill. I think I asked this question last time, and I think it might be helpful going forward as we do these things just to have, and as Representative Tipton indicated, I do think there's a big question about weightings or no weightings, but as you're adding new variables, I don't see the weighting factors associated with those as what the weights would be for these additional areas for measurement. And so I think for all of these going forward, it'd just be good to just disclose what the weightings are from the weighted to unweighted values on all tables going forward. It just keeps it clear for everyone to what they are.
Will do, President McFadden. And I can pull those up here in just a minute.
We do have those, Dr. McFadden. So if you wanted to see those, it's on another sheet there.
Yeah, and we sent out the actual probably 24 to 26 tab spreadsheet on each of these scenarios. So a total of 16 have been sent out to this point. And there's one of the tabs that was sent out to your chief budget officers metric weightings. And so you can go to that tab and see exactly what the weightings are. But I'll be happy to pull those up here in just a moment and show you what they are. But at this point, any other questions about these three scenarios that were requested by Representative Tipton? Okay, seeing no other hands raised, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the proposed metrics by Morehead State University. And I use the plural metrics because there's actually two metrics. The first metric is full-time, first-time, degree-seeking, degree certificate-seeking resident undergraduate students with income levels from $0 to $30,000. So these are the very low income students. I will point out that this is an input metric because we're talking about the entering class enrollment of these particular students. And that's why you see the heading at the top. It is a low income student enrollment metric. The actual IPEDS definition is provided there. It's the number of full-time, first-time degree certificate-seeking undergraduate students paying the in-state or in-district tuition rate who were awarded Title IV federal student aid and have income levels between $0 and $30,000. Title IV federal student aid includes both federal grants and federal student loans. So that is the metric that was put on the table by Morehead State University. Part of the rationale for that metric is that if you include a metric for very low income students in the model, it provides financial incentives for institutions to recruit and enroll students from impoverished socioeconomic backgrounds, which would expand access for that underrepresented group. So that's one of the arguments for this metric. The metric also recognizes and rewards institutions that are enrolling larger numbers of those students. And institutions that are currently enrolling those students incur added cost to try to retain and graduate those students. So this is a recognition that institutions that have larger numbers or serve larger proportions of these students actually have to expend more dollars on student services and wraparound services to get those students to the finish line. Another argument for this metric is that providing this funding upfront at enrollment, institutions can actually use those funds to provide those wraparound services that are necessary to help retain and graduate very low income students. So that's the rationale for that first metric. This second metric is very much related to the first metric. Again, it's full-time, first-time degree, certificate-seeking resident undergraduate students with income levels from $0 to $30,000. But in this case, that metric has been weighted using an index based on the proportion of low-income students served at each institution. So this metric, by providing that weighting, it recognizes not only the volume of very low income students enrolled, but it also recognizes the proportion of each institution's incoming class comprised of those students. And it provides additional funding to account for those mission differences. So that's the rationale for the second metric. I thought it would be helpful to provide some information on what are the numbers of these students served at each institution and what are the proportions served. And that's what this chart is showing to the right. Again, this is just for our public four-year institutions. And there's 8 of them, as you can see, UK, U of L, all the way through WKU. It is full-time, first-time degree certificate-seeking resident undergraduates who receive Title IV federal aid and have income levels between $0 and $30,000. This is data for academic year 2021-22. The blue bars are the actual numbers. So if you look in that first column at UK, as part of that entering class, they had 428 students that fit that criteria as receiving Title IV federal aid. They were in-state undergraduate students, and they had income levels between $0 and $30,000.
Bill, let's see what Secretary Hicks has to say first. We'll come back to that. Secretary Hicks.
Thank you. Yeah, just a couple quick questions. One, is Title IV federal aid equal Pell Grant?
I actually don't know the answer to that question. It's federal grant, so I would assume so, yes.
Yeah, it should be Pell Grant. Travis Muncy, are you on the line?
Yes, Secretary Hicks. It does include Pell Grant.
Is it only Pell Grant?
It would be other federal grants as well,
Yeah, so it would be any federal grant.
and federal student loans.
You just said loans. Question for Travis, are these all income-based eligibility items?
In I believe so, Secretary Hicks. I can take a look to make sure and get back to you. But if there are any non-income based, the vast majority, the Pell Grant is the main contributor to that number.
Yeah,
when
last
the federal
meeting, I think I heard that low income was the same as Pell Grant in the scenarios that Bill provided earlier.
It is. So there's definitely some overlap between what we use as a proxy with Pell Grant and the low income and this as well. It's just looking more at the kind of I guess the lowest income quartile from that.
No, I understand the 0 to 30. Question on the 0 to 30. In the Pell Grant eligibility, I believe there is a range based on family size. Does this 0 to 30 have a range based on family size, or is just 0 to 30 for the family income?
Well, let me jump in, Travis. Where this income level comes from, State Budget Director Hicks, when students apply and they are going to receive Title IV federal aid, they're required by the federal government. The financial aid officers have to do an expected family contribution calculation. And so they have to provide income for either their family, if they're a dependent student, or if they're an independent student, they provide their own income. And what IPEDS does, it counts anybody that's within that 0 to 30 range. If they report family income, it's family income plus the student's income. If they're a dependent student, if they're an independent student, it's just that student's income. And then they have about 5 different income ranges. The top range is 110,000 plus. So this is just the lowest of the low income ranges. So does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I think the answer is no. It didn't take into account family size on the 0 to 30.
Now, and Pell has changed that anyway to some degree. So what this is, though, I think we're answering two different things. I'm going back to my financial aid days, so if there's anybody with financial aid on here, you can correct me. This counts like the supplemental federal grants. It counts federal work study and Pell. I don't think loans are included in this category, to be honest with you. So if someone can correct me from back in my day, I'm happy to be corrected.
So let me just read this quickly. Representative Tipton, I see your hand is up, but this will respond to part of the question. Title IV aid to students includes grant aid, work study aid, and load aid. These include federal Pell Grant, federal supplemental educational opportunity grant, academic competitiveness grants, national science and mathematics access to retain talent grants, teacher education assistant for college and higher education or teach grants, federal work study, federal Perkins loans, subsidized direct or FFEL Stafford loans, and unsubsidized direct or FFEL Stafford loans. So that's the complete list. I just didn't want to list all of that on a slide and have to read that out. But I've got a very detailed definition of what is included in that Title IV federal aid. Representative Tipton, you have a question.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Payne. Just along with Director Hicks, some clarification here. This all starts with the FAFSA application form, correct?
I believe so, yes.
It does.
Now, and of course, there are going to be students who get Pell Grants that have income levels higher than this, but we're just identifying the lowest income levels within that group. and we're also including now these other grants, the bill that you mentioned, are all these within the FAFSA application, or are these things that students would apply for outside of FAFSA?
All have to be, if it's Title IV, it's all within the FAFSA.
Okay, I have one more question. He talks about certificates. Are we talking about any type of post-secondary credential or degree when we say certificate?
If it's degree seeking or certificate of an outcome seeking, yes.
Okay,
So-
here's the expanded definition. A student enrolled in a 4 or 5-year bachelor's degree program, an associate degree program, or a vocational or technical program below the baccalaureate level, who has no prior post-secondary experience and is enrolled for 12 or more semester credit hours.
So it would encompass all of those. I
Yeah,
just
so
wanted
it
clarification
includes
on that.
It includes associate degrees and vocational technical program degrees if an institution has those types
Oh.
of programs.
All right, thank you so much.
Other questions?
I have one, excuse me. I think our FAFSA applications are changing, and this issue of what is income and expected family income and all is in flux. So I hope we can get some clarification on this. The question I have is the rationale behind the weighting. If we're interested in, more students, it's about more students. Why is this weight applied in terms of proportion of students?
The only rationale I can provide is the one that was provided to me by President Morgan and Mary Pfister, the CBO there at Moorhead. And they basically said that this weighting would recognize not only the volume of very low income students enrolled, but it would recognize the proportion of those students served at each institution. And some of our smaller institutions actually serve a higher proportionate share of their full-time, first-time degree-seeking cohort is comprised of these students. And so that was the rationale that I was given. And President Morgan, Mary Pfister, if you're on the line, if either one of you want to respond in more detail to President Capilouto's question, I invite you to do so.
Dr. Payne, this is Jay Morgan. Your explanation is correct on the weighting for a percentage, trying to recognize that a greater percentage is a heavier lift for institutions to educate and apply resources to. So your explanation is correct.
Well, getting back to the graph, I've already talked about the blue bars. Those are the actual primary data for the metric. The orange diamonds, that is the percent of full-time, first-time degree-seeking undergraduate students that is comprised of the resident undergraduate students who receive Title IV aid and have those very low income levels. So basically you're saying, what is your total cohort? And then what is the percentage of that for the students who receive the Title IV aid and come from the very lowest income quintile? As you can see in the graph, in 2021-22, Eastern, UK, Western, and U of L enrolled the largest numbers of students with income levels between $0 and $30,000. That same year, Moorhead, Eastern, KSU, and Western served the largest proportion of those very low income students as a percent of their full-time, first-time degree-seeking undergraduate cohort. So as you can see, Moorhead actually has the largest proportion, almost 25% of their entering full-time, first-time degree-seeking undergraduate cohort. About a quarter of those students are from that very low income quintile. EKU is second with almost 22%. KSU 16.4%, and Western nearly 15%. Eastern also has the highest number of those students at 514, followed by UK at 428, Western at 413 students, and then U of L at 359. So I think, back to your question, President Capilouto, I think what Moorhead and Mary Pfister were trying to say is, you know, all of the other metrics in the funding model are volume driven, and that for this particular metric, not only are they recommending potentially just the volume numbers as a metric, but also maybe weighting those volumes by the proportion of students served to account for mission differences for some of our institutions that do serve, you know, larger shares of the very low income students. In terms of the scenario impacts, you can see in the table to the right again, that first column of numbers is 2024-25 actual performance fund distribution for the universities. You've got scenario 15, which is the primary data. It has not been adjusted. It's just the raw data. And you can see that allocating 3% to very low income student enrollment metric would shift some funds from Northern, UK, Murray, and U of L to Moorhead, Eastern, and Western. And that's without even any weighting. It's going to shift some dollars. And the institutions impacted the most are Northern, which it would shift a little over $1 million away from Northern. Eastern and Moorhead would be the biggest beneficiaries. Moorhead would pick up a little over 847,000, and EKU 658,000. Now, when you weight those data to reflect proportions of low-income students served, which is scenario 16, you can see that the shift in funding is even more pronounced. It is shifting $1.8 million from UK to the other institutions, 574,000 from U of L, 1.55 million from NKU to the other institutions. And again, the largest beneficiaries would be Moorhead, Eastern, and to a lesser extent, Western. So that's the impact of each of those two metrics. I will point out that last bullet is very important, that you know, a central aim of this particular metric is to provide funds to institutions that serve proportionately larger shares of very low income students. And so we did not do any sector weighting between the research sector and the comprehensive sector, because that would negate the actual purpose of the metric. If the working group were to decide to go in this direction, the purpose of this metric would be to shift some dollars in the direction of those institutions that serve proportionately greater shares of the very lowest of the low-income students attending our public universities.
I have a question. Just a quick question.
Thompson, yes.
Sure. So all these different funding sources, Pell and all the sources that were listed in the chat are in place for the folks who fall at this income level. I also just wanted to mention that they also benefit from CAPS, right, which is about $5,200 for folks who would be in this income level. So they have a number of different sort of buckets of funds that already follow them with their low income level, correct? So they're in many ways the most funded of our students, correct?
You are correct, mostly. In many cases, CAP grants are given out earlier, and so not everybody gets served all the time, but when it comes to Pell, yes. And in most cases, CAP, yes.
But these would not be funds, I just want to clarify, that would go to the student. These would be funds that would go to the institutions that are presumably incurring higher costs to provide, you know, the necessary services to support a higher proportion of very low income students.
I guess one thing I might add here is, Dr. Thompson, you may highlight that one of the reasons we shifted within the model some strategic funds to the low income population is because we're just not making inroads with that population as much as we need to reach our 60 by 30 goal. And so that's why low income was a focus. The other thing I guess I'll add, Dr. Payne, is that we could weight these numbers, but we could weight them in favor of the comprehensive institutions, which seem to be serving those. And so those weightings could also go the other way if that's the desire to serve those populations of the poorest students who are attending our institutions. So.
Well, and this is not to speak for this metric, but it is to state the obvious, at least where we're coming from at CPE. The reason why we increased the the low income percentage is that we haven't moved that dial nearly as much as we need to in a high poverty state. So yes, Dr. McFadden, this one goes to two categories of that. One is the group that we're going to see the FAFSA situation actually going to affect the most. And this is a group that tends to apply for money the latest. This is a group that's harder to move most often towards student success. And with that in regard, this becomes, in my opinion, significantly different look than the other low income category.
And at least for this, those funds we all talked about go to the student. These funds would come to the institution serving the student.
And importantly, they would come to the institution on the front end when you actually enroll the student, which is when you need to provide those, wraparound services to try to retain and graduate those students. And right now, the focus of our low income metric is on bachelor's degrees produced. And so the funding comes at the end when you actually get a student that's a Pell recipient to the baccalaureate degree. This would be, an input metric, as I said at the beginning, that would provide funding up front. And, there's always a potential, when the working group meets 2 years down the road to have a progression metric that focuses on this same group. So you could say, hey, you could get some funding when you enroll these students. You could get some additional funding if you get them to 30 credit hours, for example. And then we've got a low income metric that rewards institutions on the back end when they get a baccalaureate degree.
Dr. Thompson, can I jump in?
Sure.
Just to provide some clarity of the methodology here, and Dr. Payne kind of laid it out very amply. If we go back and look at some of the prior charts that CP has provided and that we looked at, we have 7, maybe 8 years of heavy declines in low-income students as a state. And I think we all identified in one of our prior meetings that low income was really the hole that Kentucky has missed the boat on. So as we provided this as a potential metric, we were trying to get some clarity, not knowing what the numbers would shake out as far as the financial distribution. How do we tackle the lowest of the low? There is a significant difference between a student who receives Pell money, possibly with a family income of, let's just say $65,000, and receives federal Pell aid through the FAFSA and maybe other grants and loans, versus a student who has $20,000 or $30,000 of family income. So we were trying to get at the lowest of the low. This is trying to get down to essentially abject poverty in trying to get students moving forward based off of that. And in doing so, in proposing this, we didn't know what the financial distribution was, but we were trying to tackle a problem through really a methodical way to get there, using data that was normed, data that was nationalized, and data that we could put together pretty easy. So Dr. Payne described this very well, but I just wanted to provide that clarity.
Dr.
Yeah,
Murphy.
I'll go ahead.
I was just going to add, just for the benefit of the group, about 51% of Pell recipients of four-year universities, families, report having a family income of $20,000 or less. 90% of Pell recipients on four-year institutions nationwide, their families report having a family income of $50,000 or less. So you are touching the most at risk as you look at these funds as the way to try to target this. So.
That is correct, Dr. McFadden.
Other
Bill?
questions, comments?
Bill, this is Eli. What do you think would be the impact of an alternative to this? And that would be increasing the share of the model now that is dedicated to low income, increasing the percentage.
You mean the impact of going from the 3% to the 8% that
Sure,
we did, or
sure.
we're talking
What
about?
happens if, this,
Of course.
I would say, the questions I have here, we need to move into this whole question of weighting. Because if this is the rationale, it's your percent, then are we going to apply weights to the percent of STEM students you have? We're going to weight that. You start. Are we going to
Bill, let me ask Eli a clarifying question before you jump into it. Eli, I guess I'm trying to figure out, is your question, what's the difference between what we did at 3% previously and now at 8%? Or what would be the difference if we took it from 8% to 11%?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I just want to make sure I understand.
If you want to make clear low income and, you can do it through the weights and the current definition. I mean, the percentage.
So
funding model.
if you take the 3% and add it to the 8%, that's what we're looking at here in scenario 1 and scenario 2. And of course, scenario 1 is applying no weighting between the sectors. And scenario 2 is if you apply the same weighting to the 3% that we're already applying to the 8%. So does that help answer your question?
Yeah. Is it appropriate now to talk about weighting, Aaron?
I think it's appropriate for us to talk about weighting anytime in this conversation today, because as Representative Tipton said, it may be the elephant in the room. It probably is. So yes, the answer is yes.
Sure. So I think I was one of the few, or maybe the only president in the room when we came up with this plan that we now wish to modify, and we have modified.
I was there at that time, but in a different role. Yes, as president of KSU. So yeah.
Okay, and something I recall, we keep looking at where we are today, and what it would mean today. And number one, the questions back then are where we want to go. This isn't static. It's what can drive behavior and send the correct signals. I think we work to keep it as simple as possible in terms of definitions and so forth. And then I want to recall the discussion on weighting. For decades, and through any kind of funding model you'll see across higher education, there is the acknowledgement that research universities and universities that heavily provide professional degrees like medicine and dentistry and other health degrees simply cost more. It is a reality. And back then, to recognize that reality, we applied these weights. We were trying to keep a playing field level in terms of those acknowledged costs. And those weighting factors were put in so that you wouldn't have dramatic shifts in funding. You had to acknowledge it. And the one thing we all did was undergraduate education. I know when everybody looks at the numbers here, exercising your fiduciary responsibility, you certainly can acknowledge, gee, what decision should I make regarding my income? I mean, my university, and it's the one that certainly can provide greater income. But this whole issue of weighting is one that is fundamental. Providing and expanding medical degrees and opening new medical campuses, and these are enormous. And to drive $500 million of research, that's the most costly thing we do at a research university. You don't make money on those things. So the consequence of dismissing this weighting or adopting a new one here and thinking about how consistent it is with others, I just think needs serious discussion and analysis.
Anybody else want to jump on this statement? Tim, I see it, sir.
So I agree with us needing to take a look at weighting. You know, I appreciate the difference in institutional mission, and I wasn't here for the conversation. I think it's important for us to understand kind of how the weights themselves shift dollars in the model, because I think it feels like, and I don't want to speak for my colleagues, it feels like the weightings make it really difficult to win in the model if you're not in the R1 sector. And I mean, I would like to have a better understanding of how those weights both were decided for each one of the variables, and what the effects of the weights are, because I appreciate and do not disagree with anything that Eli said, but I don't feel like we have a good understanding, at least I don't, of the weighting rationales for each one of the metrics, how it shifts dollars from sector to sector. And look, I think it is an important conversation to have, that serving the poorest of students also is very expensive and important for the state. And so I again was not here, but I think, and I think Representative Tipton was right. This is the elephant in the room. If the model is built in such a way that it's almost impossible to win, is it really a performance funding model for everyone? And I think it's a healthy conversation for us to have. I think educating everyone on the way in which this was built and how it works, and does it appear that it advantages some over others, and why? And I just think that as we work through this, having a good understanding of that would be good, not just for us as presidents, more importantly, for folks who are investing in performance funding. Are these the outcomes that we're getting that we wanted? And is the incentive fair? I think it's a healthy conversation for us to have, and for others on our campus, because I'll tell you that the folks that do the work connected to outcomes, I think sometimes feel like it doesn't matter what we do, we can't win in the model. Now, we actually have one in the model. And if I were Jay, I might, Jay, folks on your campus feel that way, right? That the way the model is built today, you can't do anything. It's why we have the equalization or the stop loss for you all.
Morehead State we cannot win.
Guys, let me remind us of something so we don't get too far off. By legislative mandate, we can only talk about the weightings within this 3%. And we can't talk about the generalized conversation, right, around weighting, even though we understand that this leads into that bigger discussion, right?
Absolutely. I just want to put that on the table for further conversation.
Well, Dr. Carboni, I see you only like Morgan State. You don't like Kentucky State.
President Carboni, I would be happy to put together all of that historical background. You know, what was the rationale for the weightings? How were they determined? What was the impact of the weightings? And come back at our next meeting and, you know, take a good, 15 minutes or so to provide all of that background. But what I can tell you just right off the top of my head, the degrees that are rewarded in the performance funding model are bachelor's degrees only. At the time that the funding model was created, UK and U of L produced, the majority or a larger proportionate share, I guess I should say, of master's degrees and doctoral degrees, which are higher cost programs. UK and U of L produced the lion's share, overwhelming majority of the federal and extramural research dollars generated. At the time the funding model was created, a lot of other states were including a metric in their funding models related to research. We felt at the time, hey, if we put a research metric in the model, that's definitely going to advantage UK and U of L. And so at the time that the model was developed, taking all of that into account, the differences in the types of degrees, and the mix of those degrees, the fact that research was not included in the model, and President Capilouto has already spoken to the issue of cost differentials. We looked at the differences in cost for faculty and staff at the R1s versus the comps. And so you have differences in cost structure. So all of that was taken into consideration. But one of the most important things of the weightings, one of the most important factors in creating the weightings was so that no funds would shift between the research sector and the comprehensive sector in the very first year that we ran the model. And so every metric was weighted so that, there would be equilibrium within each funding pool by metric, but then in total for the entire funding model, there would be equilibrium between or funding parity between the research institutions as a group and the comprehensive institutions as a group, and we accomplished that. And so what has happened over time, you've had some institutions like UK that have, performed very well in terms of being above the sector average in terms of growth on a lot of these metrics. And so you've seen some funding shift in their direction. Northern has benefited through the funding model. U of L, even though they're an R1 institution, has just more or less maintained a steady state. They haven't benefited greatly by being an R1. They haven't been disadvantaged. But I will just stop there and say that when the model was developed, the weightings ensured that no funding would shift right off the bat from the two research campuses to the comprehensives or from the comprehensive institutions to the research sector. And that was one of the main factors that allowed us to reach consensus to move forward with the funding model, because neither sector would have tolerated giving up money to the other sector. Now, money could shift within sectors, between the comprehensive institutions, money could shift. Same thing between UK and U of L, but between the two sectors in the very first year we ran the model, those weightings ensured that the Research One institutions got to keep the funding they already had in their base. The comps in the aggregate got to keep the money that they had in their base.
And so the question that I have is that what's the cumulative effect of those weights over time versus performance in the model? And I want to have a better understanding of it. I'm not opposed to it. I agree with what Eli said. It is more expensive to produce all of those degrees. I just think that educating folks, and I know this is not the time to have that broader conversation, educating folks about how these actually work, what's the cumulative effect during the course of the past decade, And I think knowing better the effects is good for all of us. And I'll be quiet.
I would be happy to do that. I need maybe 2 weeks to pull some of that together.
Dr. Thompson, I might, I think you made a good point. We're talking about 3% of the model that is at play here. The legislature, kind of gave us guidance on low income and first gen as the groups, and they were unweighted specifically by the body that sets this forth. And so there's a lot to talk about the performance funding model. While I was not a president, I was in the room and involved the whole time, and I do think there needs to be time and place to let that breathe. But I think for right now, we're talking about this 3%. And the 1.5% and unweighted. And I think that it was, I think that, we got some pretty clear cues that there's interest, at least for this 3% of the model, to be an unweighted part of the model. And so I think if we could try to come to some resolution on that today, it'll help us all move forward into maybe a broader conversation in the next legislative session or our next, working group that's outside of this task.
And bottom line, we are held to that standard. Doctor, we have to do that 3%, the weighted and unweighted, and the definition that goes along with it. So we need to stick within our categorical conversations around that, even though my guess is that weights and everything else will be a hot topic this legislative session and probably in the future to come on all of these things. But I am tasked with keeping us on task in that regard. Secretary Hicks.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. To me, the narrow question we have here is just about the 3% for this upcoming fiscal year. That is at least the really only the real immediate impact of any of our decisions. So while I completely understand the weighting rationale and respect that and everything, to avoid a shift in the middle of a biennium, if that is a partial goal here, then you keep it unweighted, because by changing it from unweighted to weighted, you're infusing a shift in the middle of a biennium. So I'm agnostic, that's not a policy statement. That's just a practical reality. And so to me, if we were to want to change it from unweighted to weighted, the better time to do that is in preparation of a future biennium, and even within the prospect of more funding in the performance model as a component of that. But I just wanted to point out from a budget perspective, the question we have here is what's the best metric for underrepresented, and that's what we should be working on. But my view is that you shouldn't make a decision that makes a major shift within the biennium. I don't think that's just a good practice to have. And that is no criticism of the weighting. That's just our real job here is to define an underrepresented student.
Fully agree. Bill, I'm going to have you move forward with anything else you want to present, but we need to be honing down the things we can live with or not live with, because we basically only have one meeting left, if you will. So scenarios, in my opinion, mostly have been run, unless there's some great desire to run more. I would hope we don't, but it comes down, and even though I think we said we cannot take a vote today because it wasn't on the agenda to take the vote, but I would sooner or later like to get, of all these scenarios, things that people could possibly live with or not live with, if you will. I've got Travis somewhere on the line that will keep me in tune with all the stuff we need to be in tune with. So Travis, if you're listening, please do that. But sooner or later, we're going to have to get to a point of that decision. That's that 3% and that definition. So Bill, is there any other item you want to bring to the table here with your spreadsheets?
No, that's it. It's open for discussion among work group members, or if you want to move on with the KCTCS portion of the program, that's up to you, President Thompson.
Well, I want to have some discussion around this. I think KCTCS, I'm not going to put you off long, KCTCS, so don't get scared. But I think the big question now will be for us to have some discussion around this 3% for the 4-year sector, period.
I have a question.
Sure.
Aaron, I know that at some point that there was a discussion of how do these new proposed metrics reflect URM students actually in terms of, percentage, comparing one to the next. That's not presented here. And I know that we're in a unique position right now looking at all these options, but could you comment on any of that?
Absolutely. And Bill and Travis are on here to give us that explanation. But I even had a legislator tell me last week or week before, I forgot, to make sure that we identify that, how well are any of these metrics representing populations that we were serving. And I'll just throw in some data. We got some preliminary enrollment. And once again, the biggest category of increase in this state in enrollment is URM, under the definition we had for it. So, Bill and Travis, do you want to throw in some of those proportions?
Yeah, Dr. Thompson. So we did run an analysis on that when we first put the first suite of scenarios together. And the two that captured the most URM students was the low income population and the high need high school population. And Bill, if you want to jump in and kind of go over that, I know we provided that, I think, in the initial with the initial packet of data that we sent out for the first or our last meeting. And that should have all of kind of the intersections of the different subgroups we were looking at and what that intersection looked like with URM. But I believe the two highest were low income, that was over 60%, and the high need high school were the two that captured the most URM students.
Travis, throwing the Moorhead metric in here. I mean, I know that's the lowest of low income, which had a fairly decent categorical explanation of URM, but did we look at that one in particular?
We actually have not had time to do that, President Thompson, because we just sort of finalized the data this past Friday and ran the scenarios on Monday. So unless I'm mistaken, Travis, you haven't had a chance to look at that yet. Is that correct?
No, we haven't yet, but I would assume that's probably going to be very close to the low income metric, just because it's, there's a lot of overlap within those two populations. But we can absolutely take a look at that and to see what it looks like. What we run into problems with, especially with the looking at it at the student level, that metric was actually pulled from IPEDS data, which is aggregated. As of now, we have the ability to look at incomes from the FAFSA for individual students, but going forward, we may not with the new FAFSA rules and kind of the new guardrails that are being put around the income data that are derived from the FAFSA. So we can look at that now, but it would probably be hard to look at going forward, like I said, just because we won't be able to see that at the student level.
Excuse me, Travis, clarify that for me. Are you saying that the proposals for the new low income may be difficult to define and ascertain because of the new FAFSA?
So for the old low income, it wouldn't be an issue because we are able to receive Pell. So how much a student receives in a Pell grant. So we can still say whether they're a Pell recipient or not. But actual income data that comes from the IRS system, institutions are no longer going to be able to provide that because they're very specific in the new FAFSA rules that says that they can only provide that for actual distribution of aid to a student.
So does that mean that what Jay proposed would be difficult to exercise?
it would be hard to do it at the student level. So, and Dr. Payne, feel free to kind of jump in here. But if I believe that was done using iPads data, so basically saying, this is the proportion of students, because it is aggregate in iPads. So you can look and see how many students fall under that category and then create a proportion from that. But as far as individual graduates, so say, an individual student that graduated, we would not know whether that student fell within that $0 to $30,000 category.
And let me make it more apropos to this conversation. Right now, we can see if this category covers a lot of the previous URN. Moving forward, you can measure this category easily. It's using iPad's aggregated data, but we would not be able to disaggregate it to see how many URN would still be in that category moving forward. However, if you use the low income at the 30,000 and below family income, you still have validated data. It's coming from iPads that's turned in. You just don't have it in a disaggregated form.
It is coming from iPad, so it would continue to live on.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just say me for one, I think introducing new metrics, whether it be student driven or high school performance driven, I'm not particularly comfortable adding new metrics. I think, some composition of low income and first gen, which we've already got set. And I think Secretary Hicks, you said it well. New metrics and new weightings in the middle of a biennium seems particularly disruptive. If there's some gradient, as Dr. Morgan has proposed, where we want to put a higher value on students who have less resources, I'm supportive of that for sure. But for me, I think sticking with this low income first gen population, at least for now, I'm comfortable with and very comfortable with trying to add some additional layers to the low income. That not all low income is the same, and I think that's Jay. I see that on my campus every day. There's students who have food insecurity, and there's just students who maybe don't have everything that they want, but they have everything they need. So
Even though we're not taking votes today, we are taking the temperature of the room. Jackie, I don't want to speak for you, but Bob Jackson has gotten hold of me, and David, he mirrored your statement just then to me. Am I correct, Jackie?
Yes, you are. I think our stance would be to continue another year the way we did the past year.
Aaron, I agree.
Anybody else have any thoughts? Once again, I'm not asking you to vote on anything. I'm just hearing your temperature. John, from what I heard you say earlier, once again, I just want to say that from a budget director standpoint, the less movement, the better. Am I correct?
Yeah. I think the middle of a biennium is not the time to shift what was already decided for us in the current year. I would just say my preference kind of leans toward Pell Grant low income as being the primary basis of the 3% weighting.
Any other temperatures in the room?
I agree with that. I mean, I like the conversation that Jay's proposal has started, but not creating turbulence in the middle of a biennium makes sense to me as well.
Representative Tipton, I know Senator Gibbons isn't here, but I'm interested in your thoughts from a legislative viewpoint. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I had a little technical problem there for a minute. The last few days of session were pretty hectic with this issue. And the amendment that passed was amendment number 7. So we worked on it quite a bit to get to what we have now. trying to get to a compromise. And I don't think it's no secret there were some people in the House that would like to have had some things that maybe the universities wouldn't have liked at all. And we got to this point. Those two factors, low income, first generation, unweighted. If that's what we left the door open to have this conversation for how we go forward to 3%, and the work group will meet again in 2 years. I will also say, no matter what this work group recommends, that does not stop a member from the General Assembly from filing legislation. So we don't know how that process might work out as well. But I'm comfortable with leaving it like we have in the current year. But I wanted to get the input of all the university presidents in our community college system on what's the best path moving forward. Because what it's all about is what's best for our citizens of Kentucky. How can we move the needle on post-secondary credentials?
I think we haven't heard from, and we don't need to hear from you now if you're not ready, if you want to think about it. The thing that I'm going to try to walk away with today is that whatever I'm hearing, we'll go back and run that last one scenario or what you will. I mean, once again, Moorhead scenario can fit into that low income area if we choose to do that as a part of it, without a doubt, whether a 1.5 or 3 or none. I mean, so I guess I'm trying to get to that point. If we have the discussion that I'm hearing most people saying, to keep it at least the low income category somewhere, which I hear is the majority of the temperature in the room. Do we include Moorhead's low income or the most poverty of the low income as a part of that conversation? Yes or no when we come back? Because we're going to come back next time and we have to take a vote and we have to move forward. So if there's any other thoughts on any of that, surely we'd like to hear it before we ask KCTCS come to the plate.
So from my perspective, I think that institutional type, mission differentiation conversation and weighting is part of a deep dive that we should do as we reevaluate the model. That's just my perspective.
Thanks, Dan.
I would only add that I think keeping it simple is important. I believe the reason we got here is the Attorney General made a determination after the Supreme Court decision, harken back to Justice Roberts' sort of focus on hardship, and low income certainly captures hardship. That's what we're supposed to focus on now. Making it less complicated is important. And I can agree with Director Hicks that you don't want to change things in the middle, but I was never part of any discussion. No one ever asked me at CPE or from anywhere about removing weights at the end of the session. And so I would just say I agree with consistency, Director Hicks, and it's a principle that I'll stand behind because it was disruptive at the last moment there, sir.
I will point out, though, and President Kapalut, I'm surely not meeting this, but when we heard this is where the General Assembly was leaning, I got all the presidents together. I think you were there, and
it was the 11th hour, the day before the last day of the session.
Right. Well, that's when we found out too, and I brought the presidents back immediately at that time. So yeah. So not to beat a dead horse here, but I heard most people say low income. I think I only heard one or possibly two say to keep the 1.5% metric for first generation. but I've heard everybody say low income. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
Did you count me among your 2 or 3
Yes.
for the first gen low income? Okay, I just want to make sure you heard me.
So
Yeah.
you did like the first gen.
Yeah, the first gen low income combo that we currently have. Yeah. Sorry, my internet is really unstable today.
And let me say, Aaron, I'm not opposed to first gen. That's a focus of ours. I think it should be a focus collectively. So
What we will do then, we'll come back with, once again, a decision point next time. Then Bill, we'll look at just the low income and first gen like we have it, and then we'll do some up and down votes. Does that sound good to everybody?
Mr. President,
Yes.
I must like to look at data too much. I know you didn't want to do any more. You didn't want to put any more on Dr. Payne. I have one suggestion based on the conversation here. Could we get a proposed model that showed the 1.5% for low income like we have now, and then 1.5% with the presentation by Moorhead, weighted and unweighted?
Yes, you can.
Just so we've got something to look at what it would look like. And I fully understand each university has a mission. You're looking out for yourself, and that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to look out for your campus and your university. But that would just give us one more option to look at to kind of broaden this
Absolutely. Yeah, I surely wouldn't like to do more than that, because we have to have a decision point next time. I think that makes sense, Representative Tipton. Without a doubt, I have to tell you, from a CPE viewpoint, where we're at in looking at moving the state forward, I think Moorhead's one makes a lot of sense to us because it's an input variable. And that makes a lot of sense to me in many cases, because it takes a little bit of the volume out. But however, we know where everybody's at, where they're coming from, but I wanted to throw a statewide perspective in there, at least from the way we see it. So we will bring back then, Bill, those just 3 next time for the 4-year campuses. Does that make sense? With that in mind, KCTCS, you're up.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, great. Thank you. I'm Brendan Lehane. I'm in here with Buddy Combs and Alicia Crouch from our IR team. We're going to do a brief presentation on just an overview on the 3 potential metrics that we reviewed with the work group at the September meeting, and then a recommendation that KCTCS leadership that we reviewed with KCTCS college leadership and President Quarles for consideration from the work group. Do I have control of the presentation, or is somebody else controlling this?
Bill, I think you have to release it to him.
Share. Do you need me to share your slides for you?
I can share them if.
Okay.
Second.
I think I've got them pulled up. Do you see them?
Yes.
Yes, we can see.
We got it. There we go. Okay. So the first metric that we reviewed with the committee last time was our underrepresented student credential metric. This is a credentials awarded metric for the prior academic year for first generation students. Students considered first generation if neither parent completed college. This is data pulled from FAFSA information type A. And that would be students that answered either neither parent attended college or one or both parents attended, but neither parent completed college. The other metrics that we reviewed with the work group last time was credentials awarded to students with dependents metric. And that is a credentials awarded to students with children or other dependents. And again, that was pulled from the annual student financial aid submission. And these are all credentials reported through CPE. The third metric we reviewed with the work group was credentials awarded to graduates of high need high schools. That was credentials awarded from a Kentucky public high school falling below state averages on proposed student metrics or a GED earner. And again, that was reviewed with the university model also. And as a reminder, the KCTCS model currently has low income credential metric already in the model, underprepared credentials metric in the model, and non-traditional age of adult credentials within the model. So the recommendations endorsed by the KCTCS President's leadership team and President Quarles was for consideration by the work group is to adopt that first generation student credential metrics as the underrepresented student metric. And then the other thing we discussed at the last meeting also was to adjust the language in the KIR regulations to include the 4% for all those three credential metrics that were tweaked at the beginning of the current year. Underrepresented student credentials metrics at 4%, the low income credentials at 4%, and the non-traditional college student credentials at 4% also. So that is all we have for you for questions and discussion.
Open up to questions. Just one quick question. The first generation student credentials, it's a little bit squishy, I guess, in the way we measure those. Have you all figured out a decent way to make sure you get your data with fidelity on that?
We got Alicia here. She feels real good about the way the data is being pulled.
Sure. Yes, it is based on the FAFSA. So we do have the first generation or not first generation status on 80% of our credentials awarded. Where we lack it a little bit are the students who are being awarded very short-term credentials of less than 9 hours. But for the most part, we have some good data on that first generation from the FAFSA. The majority of our students do fill out the FAFSA.
Secretary Hicks, your hand went up first, sir.
Yeah, just double checking. I think this may have had bad notes. I thought the minority item that we were reallocating was an 8% total. And I see 12% here among the 3 4s. So just seeking clarification.
So we had a little issue when we transitioned because previously these metrics were at 2% each. And when we were transitioning to the new metrics, we allocated 4% each. So what happened with that URM was it was 4% metric, but in the legislation, only 2% was reallocated. So 1% was reallocated to the first generation degrees and 1% to low income credentials. So we had to find a place for the other 2%, and we put it in that non-traditional college student credentials. We couldn't put it in the first gen or the low income credentials because they had been specified in the language of the bill.
And I recall that. 4%. I recall that from the last meeting, but is it going from 8 to 12?
So we already had a low income credential metric, and we already had a space for the non-traditional student age credentials at 4%. So we're not reallocating that from the URM. The URM was 4%. So we needed to reallocate just 4% of the model. That low income credentials is a metric that KCTCS has had in the model since the beginning of performance funding.
Well, and I agree because so do the other sectors. I'm still not clear what the current year's 8% comprises of and how this changes.
So we're looking at 4% of the model. So I know you see 12% on here. What happened with the model is that the first generation credentials in the current year was weighted at 1%. The low income credentials is weighted at 5%, and the non-traditional college student credentials is weighted at 6%. So that is that 12. So we want to change the weights, those 12% weights on each of those three metrics to 4, 4, and 4 instead of 1, 5, and 6. They add up to 12%. So the 4, 4, 4 is 12%. The 1 plus the 5 plus the 6 is also 12%. So we were asking for the URM, which was 4% of our model, to transition to the first generation credentials at 4%. And that, originally we had proposed low income credentials at 4% and the non-traditional age student credentials at 4%. And we would like to leave those at 4%. Does that make sense?
So I want to make sure I understand this too. So I got a little confused there for a second. I apologize. So sorry, Secretary Hicks, come back in. So the only thing you're really changing here is redefining URM to first generation.
Correct.
Yes. So because of the legislation last time only allocated 2%, we had 1% going to first generation, 1% extra going to low income credentials. So instead of 4%, it was 5%. And then we had to allocate that other 2% from URM elsewhere. So our non-traditional college student credentials was changed from 4% to 6% from last year. So that was 1% first generation credentials, 1% extra in low income credentials, and 2% extra in the non-traditional college student credentials.
And I can pull up a slide here that might help. What happened at the 11th hour last was that when the language came out, it left us short a percentage that we had to reallocate. It reallocated to the first generation degrees 1%, and it specified degrees rather than our credential metric, and then left out 2% of that was not outlined in the language. So we had to allocate that out to the non-traditional age. So what we're asking is to align them out to the 4%, 4%.
Secretary Hicks, is that answering your question? Representative Tipton.
Now I think I need to go back and read the bill again, but that's all right. We'll get it straightened out. How involved were the 16 colleges, and do you have consensus from the colleges on this proposal?
Yes, it was reviewed with all the college presidents. President Quarles reviewed this with the college president leadership team. It's been shared with the college business officers and the IR folks, but yeah, it has been endorsed by the college presidents.
Thank you.
Other questions? Thank you, KCTCS. We're not taking a vote today, but next time when you come in, be ready for it. If there's any discussion that needs to happen between now and then, I know you'll have it. Anything else to bring to this work group at this time? Travis or anybody else on the line, do we need to add anything? Bill?
No, sir.
What I will do then, folks, is we will run what y'all have asked us to run. Next time I ask you to come with your mind sharpened and your pencils ready to check something, but we have to get something to the legislature fairly soon afterwards. We are hoping to have this meeting, though, later on in this month, simply because I'll be out for a couple of weeks in November for a medical procedure, even though I don't think you need me to do these meetings, but we're going to try to solidify our recommendation as soon as we possibly can. Any final thoughts from anyone?
Just thanks.
Okay. Folks, we gave you a half hour back. Enjoy it. Make it worth your while. Thank you all so much. I'll talk to you soon.